What would you say if I told you the United States government was openly floating the idea of deploying Marines and National Guard troops into its own cities against the will of elected governors and mayors? Not a war zone overseas, but Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City. Think about that for a second. Soldiers in the streets not to defend from foreign attack but to enforce immigration detention operations and flex federal power over local authority. This isn't just some distant theory, it was proposed on live television, grilled in Congress, and torn apart by Senator Elizabeth Warren, who wasn't about to let it slide.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I rise today to urge my colleagues to reject Pete Hegseth as the next Secretary of Defense. Pete Hegseth is the most unqualified nominee for Secretary of Defense in our nation's history. At his confirmation hearing, Pete Hegseth bobbed and weaved to avoid answering just basic questions about his record. But what Hegseth failed to account for is that his entire record is damning. I'd like my Senate colleagues, people who are seriously considering voting to confirm Pete Hegseth, to think long and hard about this decision. We need a Secretary of Defense who will be ready at 2 in the morning to give life or death national security advice to the president. Would you trust Pete Hegseth, who has allegedly been so drunk at work events that he passed out on a bus and urinated in front of the hotel where his colleagues were staying? Would you trust him to answer that call? We need a Secretary of Defense who will help us root out the problem of sexual assault in the military. Would you trust Pete Hegseth, who has been credibly accused of raping a woman and buying her silence, to protect victims of sexual assault? We need a Secretary of Defense who will be able to manage the nation's largest federal agency, one that oversees almost 3.4 million people and a budget of nearly $850 billion a year. Would you trust Pete Hegseth, who drove a small veterans nonprofit to the brink of bankruptcy, to manage billions of our tax dollars? The list of glaring disqualifications goes on and on. Hegseth supports requiring every senior military officer to pass a political litmus test. This politicization of the military is a slap in the face to leaders who have served their country honorably for decades. But the point is that Pete Hegseth is not just unqualified for the role, he is a walking national security threat. We need a Secretary of Defense who will help our country meet its recruiting goals, something we are already struggling with. Pete Hegseth has said that women in the military, quote, shouldn't be in combat at all. 300,000 women have served in Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11. Pete Hegseth has now insulted every one of them. That is not how a leader of the military will inspire people to join our cause. When people are responsible for our national defense, we ask something extraordinary of them. We ask them to put their lives on the line. All three of my brothers served in the military. My oldest brother was career military. And so I know how important that service is and how important it is that we pick the right person to lead our men and women in uniform. Pete Hegseth claims that our brave women in the military are somehow lowering our standards. But it is his lack of qualifications, his lack of character, and his lack of judgment that lower the standards for Secretary of Defense. We need a Secretary of Defense who we can rely on to keep all of us safe. Frankly, it is hard to imagine a worse choice than Pete Hegseth.
Because if troops can be sent to one city today, what's stopping them from being sent to 15 tomorrow? And that's where the fight turned explosive. It all started with Los Angeles. Over the objections of California officials, President Trump ordered thousands of National Guard troops and hundreds of U.S. Marines into the city. The stated reason? To support immigration detention operations carried out by ICE. But this wasn't simply about enforcement. It was a deliberate move to override the wishes of state and local leaders, replacing their authority with federal muscle. To many it looked less like a security measure and more like a dangerous experiment in political power. Los Angeles wasn't just a city dealing with immigration policy, it suddenly became the testing ground for whether a president could treat American streets like occupied territory. And it didn't stop there. On national television, Trump went further. He threatened to send ICE agents and potentially troops into other major cities he called the core of the Democrat power centers, specifically naming Chicago and New York. Imagine hearing that your city might suddenly see Marines patrolling neighborhoods not at the request of your governor or mayor but at the direct order of Washington. This wasn't just a political jab, it was a signal that entire regions of the country could be targeted for military enforcement simply because they leaned blue on the political map. That threat alone was enough to spark outrage. And that's where Elizabeth Warren entered the picture. When Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth sat before the Senate, Warren didn't waste time. She cut straight to the point, asking whether he would obey if the president ordered troops into cities like Chicago or New York, even if local leaders objected. Hegseth's response was evasive but telling. He tried to defend the Los Angeles deployment, saying it was about protecting federal law enforcement agents. But when pressed, his words made clear that yes, he would follow orders even if it meant overriding state authority. Warren wasn't satisfied. She pushed harder. What if the president wanted troops in not just 2 cities but 15? Would Hegseth carry that out as well? His refusal to answer directly exposed exactly what Warren was warning about: unchecked power in the hands of one man. This was where Warren reframed the entire issue. She wasn't just talking about ICE or about California. She was raising the alarm on authoritarian overreach. Her argument was blunt: militarizing American streets isn't about law and order, it's about political control. Every soldier deployed domestically is one less soldier available to handle real global threats, and when a government starts using military power against its own cities, the line between democracy and authoritarianism begins to blur. Hegseth tried to fall back on talking points about protecting agents from mobs and defending the homeland. But Warren wasn't letting him hide behind slogans. Instead, she went deeper. If you're willing to send troops into American cities, she asked, how many can you deploy before you start to cripple our ability to defend against real enemies abroad? This wasn't just about legal authority, it was about strategy, readiness, and national safety. Hegseth dodged again, claiming the Defense Department was satisfied with global capabilities, but he refused to give a clear number. Warren pressed. If you've done the analysis, let us in on it. What's the threshold before this plan starts undermining America's defense? Still no straight answer. His refusal was damning, because if the Pentagon can't or won't admit how far this domestic deployment strategy could stretch, then the risks are obvious. America could end up weaker abroad, all while turning its own cities into militarized zones at home. And then came the sharpest blow. Warren asked if the Supreme Court ordered the military to withdraw troops from city streets, would Hegseth obey? After squirming, he finally admitted that yes, the Defense Department would comply with a Supreme Court ruling. That single answer revealed just how fragile this entire scheme was. The administration was pushing the limits of legality, hoping no one would challenge them in court. Warren exposed that the whole plan was hanging by a legal thread, but Warren wasn't finished. She delivered her closing strike by calling the entire operation un-American. Deploying military forces to U.S. cities against the will of local governments wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. It undermined democracy by silencing the voices of governors and mayors elected by the people. And it created the image of America as a country where soldiers aren't defending freedom abroad, but intimidating citizens at home. Her message was clear: this isn't leadership, it's a power grab dressed up as security. Every soldier patrolling an American street is one less soldier protecting the nation's real interests across the globe. And if unchecked, this kind of thinking could leave America both weaker and more divided. That's why Warren's grilling matters. She wasn't just asking hypothetical questions. She was laying bare a strategy that, if taken further, could fundamentally change the relationship between the federal government and the states, between the military and the people. The danger isn't only in what has already been done, but in what could come next. If Los Angeles was the beginning, then the threat of Chicago, New York, or 15 cities wasn't just a wild scenario, it was the logical extension of a government that believes federal authority trumps all. And Warren made it impossible to ignore. So here we are, left with a choice. Do we accept the idea of soldiers patrolling our own cities as the new normal, or do we question the wisdom and the motives behind such a move? Because once that line is crossed, rolling it back may not be so easy. And Warren's warning is as much about the future as it is about the present. This isn't about politics, it's about the kind of country we want to live in. One where power is kept in check, or one where fear decides who holds control. And that's why this exchange will be remembered. Because it wasn't just a senator sparring with a defense secretary. It was a glimpse into the stakes of America's democracy in real time. The fight over Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York wasn't about immigration or ICE, it was about whether we still believe in local voices or whether military boots on American streets are just the beginning. So what do you think? Should the military ever be deployed to American cities against the will of local leaders? Or is that a step too far that threatens our democracy itself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button because the next video dives into an even more controversial showdown you won't want to miss.